They thought he was just another lost case, an unprepared, unqualified man fighting against a system built to crush him. The judge smirked. The lawyer laughed. The courtroom whispered. But when Marcus Bennett stepped forward, he didn't just defend himself. He exposed a truth so shocking it shook the entire legal system to its core. A stolen home, a forged signature, and a fight no one expected him to win. This is the story of the underestimated man who left everyone stunned. Welcome to H2 Black 3 A Thread, where untold stories find their voice. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos, because the truth deserves to be told. Marcus Bennett adjusted the collar of his slightly worn-out blazer, took a deep breath, and stepped into the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him with a resounding thud, sealing him into an unfamiliar battlefield, a place where people like him rarely stood a chance. This wasn't just a legal fight. This was survival. The fluorescent lighting in the courtroom flickered slightly, casting a dim glow over the polished mahogany furniture. To the left sat Gregory Henshaw, a corporate attorney in a sleek, dark gray suit that looked like it cost more than Marcus made in a year. Henshaw leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks with the air of a man who had already won. His smug expression was infuriating, as if he saw Marcus as nothing more than a minor inconvenience, an unqualified nuisance who would soon be swept aside. At the front of the room, presiding over the case, was Judge Richard Calloway. The man was in his late 50s, with graying hair combed neatly back, and a pair of rimless glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. His reputation preceded him. Calloway was notoriously corporate-friendly, known for siding with big businesses and banks. Marcus clenched his fists. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. As Marcus made his way toward the defendant's table, he could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. The gallery was sparsely filled, mostly legal clerks and a few older spectators who enjoyed watching court proceedings unfold like live theater. When he took his seat, he noticed how the entire courtroom was structured against people like him. The judge sat high above, physically elevated as if to reinforce the power imbalance. Henshaw had a team, 2 associates and a paralegal sitting beside him, neatly arranging documents, whispering strategies, ready to overwhelm Marcus with legal jargon. Meanwhile, Marcus was alone, no lawyer, no team, just a folder of documents he had spent 6 months studying late into the night at his kitchen table. As the bailiff called the session to order, Marcus straightened his posture. He wouldn't let them see him sweat. Judge Calloway peered down at him, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "Mr. Bennett, are you representing yourself?" The way he said it dripped with amusement, as if the very idea was ridiculous. A few quiet chuckles echoed from the plaintiff's side. Marcus met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." Calloway exhaled through his nose and shook his head slightly, as if already regretting allowing this case to proceed. "I assume you understand the difficulty of representing yourself in a property dispute against a corporate entity." Marcus nodded. "I do. And yet you still insist." "I don't have a choice, Your Honor." The judge studied him for a long moment before flipping open a file. "Very well. Let's proceed." Across the room, Gregory Henshaw leaned over to his assistant and whispered something. His assistant chuckled softly, nodding. Marcus caught it, the way they wanted him to hear their amusement. They thought he was a joke. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Henshaw rose to his feet, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket before walking toward the judge's bench. He moved with ease, confidence radiating from every step. This was his domain. "Your Honor, let's not waste time here. The law is clear. The property in question was foreclosed upon through entirely legal means. My client followed every necessary procedure, and the defendant simply failed to meet his obligations. He gestured toward Marcus without looking at him, as if he wasn't even worth acknowledging. This is not about sympathy. It's about responsibility. Contracts are binding, obligations must be met, and Mr. Bennett failed to meet his. That's all there is to it. Henshaw folded his hands in front of him, offering the judge a practiced smile. Marcus kept his face still, though inside he was boiling. Henshaw was acting like this was just another routine case, just another poor person losing their home to a corporation that barely considered them human. But Marcus knew something that Henshaw didn't. He had found something. Marcus stood, adjusting his blazer, and took a step forward. His voice was steady. "Your Honor, I appreciate Mr. Henshaw's ability to summarize the law so concisely, but there's something missing from his argument." Judge Calloway lifted an eyebrow. "Oh. And what is that, Mr. Bennett?" Marcus took a breath. This was his moment. "The question isn't whether my grandmother's home was foreclosed. The question is whether the foreclosure was legal." A small murmur rippled through the courtroom. Henshaw's smirk faltered for just a second before he scoffed. "This should be good." Marcus ignored him and reached into his folder. He pulled out 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement and handed them to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge. "These are 2 separate copies of the same mortgage agreement, one from the original filing and one from a modification made a year later." Calloway frowned, flipping through the pages. "And," Marcus's voice was sharp, "if you compare the signatures, you'll see that they don't match." The room went silent. Henshaw leaned forward slightly, suddenly paying attention. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents more carefully. His fingers tapped lightly against his bench as he analyzed them. Marcus continued. "The second signature, the one on the modification, was signed 3 months after my grandmother suffered a stroke. She was in the hospital, unable to write, and yet this document was filed as if she personally signed it." More murmurs spread through the courtroom. For the first time, there was doubt. Henshaw quickly recovered, shaking his head with a condescending chuckle. "Signatures change over time, Mr. Bennett. Your Honor, this is nothing but an attempt to stall the inevitable." Marcus held his ground. "Perhaps, but if that's the case, then surely Mr. Henshaw and his client won't mind if I request full discovery on the document's history." Henshaw's jaw visibly clenched, the reaction Marcus had been waiting for. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, staring at Marcus as if finally seeing him as more than just an uneducated defendant. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're making a serious accusation here, Mr. Bennett." Marcus nodded. "I am." The judge flipped through the documents one last time before setting them down. He exhaled. "Very well. I'll allow the defense to proceed with their argument." Across the room, Henshaw's confidence had noticeably faded. His fingers drummed against the table, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Marcus. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't entirely against him. He had forced them to listen. This was just the beginning. Marcus sat back down at the defendant's table, his mind racing. He had planted the first seed of doubt in Judge Calloway's mind, but that was far from enough to win this case. He knew how these proceedings worked. Corporate lawyers like Gregory Henshaw weren't easily shaken. Across the room, Henshaw leaned back in his chair, tapping a polished finger against his temple. The confident smirk from earlier had faded slightly, replaced by something more calculating. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by a defendant with no legal background. And that made him dangerous. Judge Calloway rubbed his temples, clearly annoyed that the case was turning into more than the open and shut ruling he had anticipated. With an impatient sigh, he adjusted his glasses and turned his attention back to the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Henshaw, Your client is expected to provide documentation that proves the foreclosure was processed legally. Do you have anything to present in response to Mr. Bennett's concerns? Henshaw flashed a practiced smile and stood. Of course, Your Honor. In fact, we have everything we need right here. He gestured to his assistant, a young man in a crisp navy blue suit, who promptly handed a thick folder to the bailiff. The bailiff walked it over to Judge Calloway, who flipped through its contents, scanning the pages with disinterest. As you can see, Henshaw continued, the foreclosure process was entirely above board. The mortgage was reviewed multiple times and the documentation was notarized appropriately. Marcus narrowed his eyes as he listened. The way Henshaw spoke, it was too smooth, too prepared, like he was trying to cover something up. Henshaw clasped his hands together and continued. The defendant claims the signature on the modification document does not match his grandmother's usual handwriting. That's quite an assertion, but let's be realistic. Handwriting can vary, especially with age. Marcus clenched his fists under the table. They were trying to gaslight him. And more importantly, Henshaw added, even if the signature had some irregularities, that does not mean the foreclosure was illegal. My client followed standard banking procedures, and this home was legally seized due to non-payment. Judge Calloway barely looked up from the file before nodding. That's reasonable. Mr. Bennett, do you have any actual proof that the documents were forged? Marcus inhaled deeply. This was exactly what he had feared. The judge was clearly inclined to trust the corporate lawyer over him, no matter how much evidence Marcus presented. But Marcus had expected this. He wasn't done yet. Marcus stood. He needed to strike now. Your Honor, I would like to request a full forensic analysis of my grandmother's signatures on all submitted documents. Henshaw scoffed before the judge could respond. Oh, come on, Your Honor. We are talking about a minor discrepancy in handwriting, not a criminal case. Judge Calloway hesitated. Marcus seized the moment. With all due respect, Your Honor, if a multi-million-dollar bank is so confident in their case, why are they afraid of a simple verification process? Henshaw's expression hardened. We are not afraid of anything. This is a delay tactic, plain and simple. Marcus turned to the judge. If it's just a delay tactic, then it shouldn't be an issue, right? The courtroom fell silent. The spectators, though few in number, were beginning to take an interest. Judge Calloway exhaled loudly, clearly frustrated. He shot a glance at Henshaw. Mr. Henshaw, does your client have the original notarized documents on file? Henshaw's smile froze for just a second, a fraction of hesitation. It was quick, but Marcus caught it. We would need time to retrieve them. Gotcha. Marcus didn't let up. Your Honor, that means the bank filed this case without even having the original, legally binding documents. How is that acceptable? The judge sighed again. He wasn't happy about it, but Marcus had made his point. Very well. Mr. Henshaw, your client will need to provide the original foreclosure documents before I can make a ruling. Henshaw forced a tight-lipped smile and nodded, but Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders. He had struck a nerve. As the judge called for a short recess, Marcus stepped outside the courtroom into the hallway. He needed to clear his mind. He was doing better than expected, but he wasn't winning yet. Suddenly, he felt a presence beside him. You're smarter than I thought. Marcus turned to see a woman in her early 40s, dressed in a tailored blazer, standing with her arms crossed. Excuse me, he asked, studying her carefully. The woman smirked slightly. I work in property law. I've seen cases like yours before, and I've seen that judge before. Marcus stiffened. And, she glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, Calloway doesn't rule against banks, ever. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had suspected the judge was biased, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made it real. Then I'm screwed, aren't I? The woman shook her head. Not necessarily. The only way you're winning this case is if you expose something so big that Calloway has no choice but to rule fairly. Marcus nodded slowly. He already knew what he needed to do. Marcus spent the rest of the recess scrolling through his phone, searching for any past cases involving Henshaw's law firm and fraudulent foreclosures. What he found made his blood run cold. Over a dozen foreclosure cases handled by the same law firm had resulted in wrongful evictions. Several homeowners had filed complaints about missing paperwork and questionable signatures. 2 years ago, a whistleblower had come forward but had been silenced before the case gained traction. And then he found it. An old online forum post from a former bank employee, someone who had worked on foreclosure documents. The post was years old, but it mentioned something crucial. I left because they forced me to notarize documents I knew were fraudulent. They knew people wouldn't fight back, so they got away with it. I still have old emails proving it. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. If this person still had those emails, it could blow the whole case open. As Marcus returned to the courtroom, he knew one thing for sure: this was no longer just about his grandmother's home. If he played this right, he could expose an entire network of fraudulent foreclosures. He took his seat. Across the room, Henshaw was back to his usual smug self, having recovered from the minor setback earlier. But Marcus was no longer just fighting to win. He was fighting to expose the truth. And if the whispers about Judge Calloway were true, then this case wasn't just about money. It was about power and the people willing to abuse it. Marcus adjusted his tie. "Let's do this," he muttered under his breath. The moment Marcus stepped back into the courtroom, he could feel the shift in the air. Something had changed. Judge Calloway sat in his elevated position, rubbing his temple as if this entire case was nothing more than an irritation. Across the room, Gregory Henshaw sat with his usual smug expression, but Marcus noticed the way his fingers drummed against the desk, the way his eyes darted toward his assistant. He was nervous. That was good. Marcus wanted him nervous. After the last recess, Judge Calloway had ordered Henshaw to provide the original notarized mortgage documents, and Marcus had caught a glimpse of hesitation on his face. He didn't have them, at least not legally. And now, Marcus had even more ammunition. Judge Calloway tapped his gavel twice. "Court is back in session." He glanced at Henshaw. "Mr. Henshaw, do you have the original foreclosure documents for submission?" For the briefest moment, Henshaw hesitated. "Your Honor, we are still in the process of retrieving them from the bank's archives." Marcus leaned forward. "And how long will that take?" Henshaw shot him a sharp glare before turning back to the judge. "We anticipate having them shortly, but given the complexity of financial record keeping." "Mr. Henshaw." Calloway's voice was clipped, already losing patience. "Are you telling me your client proceeded with foreclosure without having the original legal documents in hand?" Marcus caught the subtle twitch in the judge's jaw. Calloway didn't like being made to look foolish. Henshaw cleared his throat. "Of course not, Your Honor. The documents exist. There's simply a minor delay in accessing them." Marcus smiled inwardly. This was the opening he needed. "Your Honor, I would like to formally request that, in the absence of these crucial original documents, this case be dismissed." A murmur ran through the small audience. Henshaw snapped his head toward Marcus. "That is absurd. The existence of the documents is not in question." Marcus tilted his head. "Then why haven't you produced them?" Silence. Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose. He didn't want to rule in Marcus's favor, that much was obvious. But without those documents, even he had to acknowledge that something was off. Marcus had forced them into a corner, and now the real fight would begin. Later that evening, as Marcus sat in his small apartment going over his notes, his phone buzzed. One new email. The subject line was vague: They don't want you to find this. Marcus's stomach twisted. His case had already drawn some attention, but he wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. He hesitated before clicking on the email. The message was short. You're not wrong about the documents. This is bigger than just your grandmother's house. Check the attachment. Keep fighting. Attached was a confidential bank report. Marcus's eyes widened as he read through it. It wasn't just his grandmother's home. Over 200 foreclosures had been processed using falsified signatures. Henshaw's law firm had handled dozens of these cases. The internal review flagged multiple irregularities, but those reports were buried. This was more than a simple clerical error. This was a systemic fraud operation. Marcus's hands tightened around the phone. This was the proof he needed. But who had sent it? His mind raced. The email address was a generic burner account. He couldn't trace it. But someone inside the bank wanted this information to be known. Someone wanted justice, and Marcus was about to give it to them. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. He sat outside in his car, staring at his phone, debating his next move. If he used this evidence, it would change everything. It wouldn't just be about his grandmother's home anymore. It would expose an entire operation. But it also meant Henshaw and his firm would fight harder than ever to shut him down. He exhaled, tightening his grip on the phone. He had no choice. He was going all in. As soon as court resumed, Marcus stood. Your Honor, I have newly discovered evidence that needs to be reviewed immediately. Judge Calloway frowned. What evidence? Marcus handed the printed document to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge's bench. Henshaw stiffened. The moment Calloway scanned the pages, his expression changed. The usual arrogance was gone. He wasn't just annoyed anymore, he was worried. Mr. Bennett, where did you obtain this? An anonymous source, Your Honor. The document is from the bank's internal audit, confirming fraudulent foreclosure practices across multiple cases, including mine. Henshaw shot up from his seat. Objection, Your Honor. This is an unverified document from an unknown source. Calloway held up a hand, silencing him. I will determine its validity, Mr. Henshaw. The judge continued reading, his frown deepening. Henshaw's firm was mentioned repeatedly in the report. Henshaw knew he was in trouble. For the first time, Marcus saw fear flash across Henshaw's face. Your Honor, this is an attempt to derail the case with baseless accusations. Marcus shook his head. You're right about one thing, Mr. Henshaw. This case is no longer just about me. The room went silent. This is about every family that lost their home because of illegal banking practices. This is about a system that was built to favor people like you over people like me. Judge Calloway looked from Marcus to Henshaw, tapping his fingers against the bench. He was weighing his options. If he ignored the evidence now, he would be complicit. Marcus waited. Then Calloway sighed. I am ordering a temporary halt to this foreclosure until further investigation into the validity of these documents can be conducted. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Henshaw's face turned red. Your Honor, this is outrageous. But Calloway wasn't listening anymore. He simply adjusted his glasses and turned to Marcus. Mr. Bennett, I hope you understand what you're doing. Marcus met his gaze. I do, Your Honor. Because this was no longer just about one house. This was about justice. Marcus Bennett sat at the defendant's table, his hands resting on the folder containing the bombshell evidence that had just upended the entire case. The courtroom was no longer the hostile environment it had been when he first walked in. The spectators, previously indifferent, now leaned forward in their seats. Even Judge Richard Calloway, who had been dismissive of Marcus from the beginning, looked more serious now, more cautious. But across the room, Gregory Henshaw was furious. The normally unshakable corporate lawyer had lost his smug confidence. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists as he whispered furiously with his assistant. Marcus knew why. This wasn't just about his grandmother's home anymore. The leaked documents he had submitted for evidence revealed that Henshaw's firm was deeply involved in a massive foreclosure fraud scheme. The whole courtroom could sense it. The tide was turning, and Marcus wasn't done yet. Judge Calloway tapped his gavel twice, calling the room to order. His tone was noticeably different now, more measured. "Mr. Bennett, the evidence you have submitted raises significant concerns. However, I need to confirm its authenticity before we proceed further." Henshaw immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I object to the inclusion of these documents. This so-called evidence was obtained through illegal means. We have no way of verifying its legitimacy." Marcus had been expecting this argument. He was ready. "Your Honor, my evidence came from a whistleblower inside the bank. The report I submitted is an internal audit that the bank itself conducted, one that they deliberately chose to hide." Calloway frowned, flipping through the document again. Marcus continued. "The email I received was anonymous, but the contents match up with real foreclosure records. These aren't fabricated accusations. They show a pattern: hundreds of foreclosures carried out with fake documents, rushed processes, and missing paperwork." Henshaw cut in sharply. "Your Honor, this is absurd. An anonymous source. You can't be seriously considering evidence from an unknown informant." Marcus held up his hand. "Then let's verify it. If the bank claims my evidence is false, let them provide their own audit reports." Henshaw froze. That was the checkmate move, because Marcus already knew the bank would never release those records voluntarily. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses and sighed. "Mr. Henshaw, your firm is mentioned multiple times in these reports. If you are confident that your client acted legally, you should have no problem providing documentation that proves it." Henshaw's expression darkened. He had walked into a trap. Before Henshaw could recover, Marcus turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to call a witness to testify regarding these documents." Henshaw snapped his head toward Marcus. "Absolutely not." But Judge Calloway had no choice but to allow it. He hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Bennett." The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A woman entered, a middle-aged notary, Linda Brooks. Marcus could see the slight tremble in her hands as she walked toward the witness stand. She was nervous. She was about to go up against a very powerful law firm. As she took her oath, Marcus approached. "Miss Brooks, can you state your profession for the record?" She cleared her throat. "I was a notary public. I handled legal documents, mortgage signings, and other official certifications for clients." Marcus nodded. "Are you familiar with the mortgage modification that my grandmother allegedly signed?" Her fingers gripped the edge of the stand. "Yes." A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Marcus took a step forward. "Did you personally witness my grandmother signing that document?" A pause. A long, tense pause. Then Linda took a deep breath and spoke the words that shattered the case. "No, I did not." The reaction was instant. A gasp rippled through the room. Someone in the gallery muttered, "Oh, damn." Even Judge Calloway sat up straighter. Henshaw shot out of his chair. "Objection." "This is just hearsay." Calloway raised a hand. "Overruled. I want to hear this." Marcus kept his focus on Linda. "Miss Brooks, if you didn't witness the signature, how did your seal end up on the document?" She swallowed hard. "I was given the papers by a representative from the bank. They told me the homeowner had already signed and just needed my stamp." Another murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marcus nodded, pushing further. "So you stamped a document that you never actually saw my grandmother sign?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. And I didn't realize at the time that the signature was forged." Boom. Marcus could hear Henshaw's teeth grinding from across the room. The weight of her words settled like a stone in the air. The bank had knowingly submitted a fraudulent document. Judge Calloway turned to Henshaw. His patience was gone. "Mr. Henshaw, do you have any explanation for why your client submitted a notarized document that was never actually witnessed?" Henshaw fought for composure. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a misunderstanding. Miss Brooks is clearly mistaken." Marcus cut him off. "Then let's check the bank's records. If the signature is legitimate, they should have no issue producing the original, wet ink signed version of the mortgage agreement." Silence. A long, painful silence, because they couldn't produce it. They had built their entire case on a lie. Judge Calloway removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking as if he aged 5 years in the last few minutes. Then he turned back to Henshaw. "Mr. Henshaw, given the testimony and the newly submitted evidence, I am officially placing a hold on all foreclosure proceedings in this case." The room erupted. Henshaw jumped up. "Your Honor, you can't." Calloway slammed his gavel. "This court will not proceed on fraudulent documentation. Unless your client can provide legally verifiable paperwork, this foreclosure is invalid. Do I make myself clear?" Marcus sat back, exhaling. He had done it. He had forced them to face the truth. After court adjourned, Marcus gathered his things. He could feel eyes on him, some full of admiration, some of anger. As he walked toward the exit, Judge Calloway called his name. Marcus turned. For the first time, the judge's expression wasn't dismissive. It was respectful. "You proved your case today, Mr. Bennett." Marcus gave a small nod. "I just wanted the truth." Calloway studied him for a moment, then nodded back. "You got it." As Marcus stepped into the hallway, he heard hushed voices behind him. "That man should be a lawyer." Marcus smiled to himself. Maybe. But for now, he had a home to save. The moment court adjourned for the day, Marcus Bennett knew he had made enemies. Judge Calloway had put a hold on his grandmother's foreclosure, and the bank's fraudulent practices had been exposed in front of the entire courtroom. That alone was a huge victory. But Marcus wasn't naive. He knew this fight wasn't over. As he stepped outside the courthouse, he could feel the eyes on him, some filled with admiration, others with barely concealed contempt. Gregory Henshaw was furious, and Marcus knew the lawyer wouldn't go down without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. That night, Marcus sat at his small kitchen table, flipping through the pages of his notes. He had compiled every piece of evidence he had, but it still wasn't enough. Henshaw and the bank were going to fight back. Hard. He needed more. As he took a sip of coffee, his phone buzzed. One new email. The subject line sent a shiver down his spine. "They're lying to you." Marcus frowned and opened the email. "You're on the right track, but you're not seeing the full picture. They've done this before many times. Check the attachment. Use it wisely." No sender. No signature. Just a single PDF file attached. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before clicking it open. And then, his breath caught in his throat. It was an internal email chain from the bank. The messages revealed direct discussions about forging foreclosure documents. They specifically mentioned cases where signatures had been altered or fabricated. Henshaw's law firm had been involved in at least a dozen of these fraudulent cases. One message even suggested fast-tracking foreclosures in minority communities because they won't have the resources to fight back. Marcus felt sick. This wasn't just about his grandmother's home. This was systemic. This was calculated. This was a criminal enterprise disguised as routine banking. And now he had proof. Just as Marcus was processing what he had, there was a loud knock at his door. His heart pounded. It was almost midnight. Who the hell would be here now? Slowly he stood and moved toward the door. Knock. 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 Harder this time, more urgent. Marcus hesitated, then peered through the peephole. Outside stood a man in a dark suit, his face unreadable. Marcus didn't open the door. Instead, he spoke through it. "Who are you?" The man's voice was smooth. "Just someone who wants to help you and warn you." Marcus clenched his jaw. "I don't need your help." A pause. "Then, if you go public with what you have, you won't just be exposing the bank. You'll be making enemies that don't play by the rules." Marcus's grip tightened on the doorknob. "That sounds a lot like a threat." The man let out a soft chuckle. "Call it advice. Be careful who you go up against." And just like that, he was gone. Marcus stood there, staring at the door, his pulse racing. This was bigger than he thought. Much bigger. But he wasn't backing down. The next morning, Marcus sat outside the courthouse, staring at his phone. Should he submit the email to the court? If he did, it could blow the entire case wide open. But it could also make him a bigger target. He needed a strategy. Suddenly, a thought hit him. Instead of going straight to the judge, he needed to make this public. He needed leverage. Marcus quickly composed an email with the leaked documents and sent it to 3 investigative journalists. One from a major newspaper, one from a legal watchdog group, and one from an independent investigative journalist who specialized in corporate corruption. He kept his message simple. This is bigger than just one foreclosure case. If you want the story of the year, look into this. He hit send. Now, even if something happened to him, the truth would get out. When Marcus walked into the courtroom later that day, he could tell Henshaw knew something was wrong. The lawyer was already whispering furiously to his assistant, his usual arrogance replaced with concern. Judge Calloway entered, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Bennett, do you have any further evidence to present before we proceed?" Marcus stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I have obtained internal bank communications that confirm fraudulent foreclosure practices." A ripple went through the room. Henshaw immediately jumped to his feet. "Objection. There is no proof that these emails are legitimate." Marcus didn't even blink. "Then let's have a forensic analysis done. If the bank wants to prove me wrong, they can hand over their own email logs." Silence. Marcus knew they wouldn't dare. Judge Calloway exhaled and turned to Henshaw. "Mr. Henshaw, does your client have a response to these allegations?" Henshaw was visibly sweating now. He had no response. Marcus had him cornered. Just as the courtroom was descending into chaos, a phone rang. One of the clerks hurried to the judge's bench and whispered something in his ear. Judge Calloway's face turned pale. He turned to the courtroom. "We are taking a brief recess." Marcus frowned. Something was happening. As he stepped out of the courtroom, he checked his phone. That's when he saw it. His leaked documents had already gone viral. The New York Times had published a breaking story on fraudulent foreclosures. The legal watchdog group was calling for a full federal investigation. Social media was exploding with outrage. This wasn't just a courtroom case anymore. This was a national scandal. When court resumed, Henshaw was gone. Marcus blinked. Where the hell was he? Judge Calloway cleared his throat. "Mr. Henshaw has been removed from the case. The bank's legal team is currently under federal review." Marcus exhaled. He had won. Not just for his grandmother, but for every family who had been cheated. Judge Calloway looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Bennett, you just changed everything." Marcus nodded. "That was the point, Your Honor." As Marcus walked out of the courthouse, a journalist rushed up to him. "Mr. Bennett, do you have a comment on today's ruling?" Marcus thought for a moment before responding. "Yeah, if they think people like me won't fight back, they're dead wrong." And with that, he walked away. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Marcus Bennett stood outside the courthouse, the morning air crisp with the energy of something far bigger than himself. Just days ago, he had walked into this courtroom alone, underestimated and dismissed. Now, the world was watching. The leaked emails, the fraudulent foreclosures, the systemic abuse, it had all been exposed. His fight wasn't just about one house anymore. It was about hundreds, maybe even thousands. And today, justice would be served. When Marcus entered the courtroom, he immediately noticed two things. Judge Calloway looked different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something colder. The scandal had forced him into a corner. He could no longer protect the bank without risking his own career. Henshaw was missing. Instead, a new lawyer sat at the plaintiff's table, a stiff, gray-haired man in an expensive three-piece suit, a crisis attorney. Marcus smirked. The bank was panicking. He took his seat. This was it. Judge Calloway cleared his throat. Court is now in session. All eyes turned to the bank's new lawyer. The man stood slowly, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, in light of recent developments, my client has chosen to withdraw its foreclosure case against Mr. Bennett's grandmother. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Marcus didn't react. Not yet. Judge Calloway frowned. Are you stating that the bank is conceding the case? The attorney nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Marcus still said nothing. Judge Calloway turned to him. Mr. Bennett, given the plaintiff's decision, your grandmother's home is no longer at risk of foreclosure. Congratulations. Marcus looked straight at the judge. That's not enough, Your Honor. A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Calloway narrowed his eyes. What do you mean, Mr. Bennett? Marcus stood up. They aren't just guilty of wrongfully foreclosing on my grandmother's home. They've done this to hundreds of families. They've used fraudulent documents, manipulated homeowners, and relied on people not fighting back. He took a step forward. So no, Your Honor, I don't just want my grandmother's house back. I want the people responsible to be held accountable. The courtroom erupted. The bank's lawyer was on his feet in an instant. Objection. This is beyond the scope of this case. Judge Calloway held up his hand. Overruled. I want to hear what Mr. Bennett has to say. Marcus turned to the judge. Your Honor, I am requesting that all cases involving this bank's foreclosures over the past 5 years be reopened and reviewed for fraud. Gasps spread through the room. The bank's lawyer's face went pale. Judge Calloway rubbed his temples. This was becoming bigger than he ever expected. Mr. Bennett, are you aware of what you're asking for? Marcus nodded. Yes, Your Honor. If we let this go, more families will lose their homes illegally. If the justice system is real, then it needs to work for everyone, not just the wealthy. Silence. Then, to everyone's shock, Judge Calloway sighed and nodded. Request granted. Everything happened fast after that. A full federal investigation was launched into the bank's foreclosure practices. Families who had lost their homes illegally were contacted and given a chance to fight back. Multiple executives at the bank resigned, facing possible criminal charges. Henshaw's law firm was shut down and he was disbarred. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he could breathe, but there was one last thing left to do. As the case wrapped up, Marcus turned back to Judge Calloway. For weeks, the judge had been a wall standing between Marcus and justice. But now, he had no power left to protect the bank. Marcus took a step forward. Your Honor, I have one final request, Calloway exhaled. And what is that, Mr. Bennett? Marcus didn't break eye contact. I want you to recuse yourself from every future foreclosure case. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Calloway's face darkened. You're questioning my ability to preside fairly. Marcus didn't blink. I'm saying that you let this happen under your watch. Either you were incompetent or you didn't care. Either way, people like you shouldn't be making decisions that decide who keeps their homes. The tension in the room was thick. Judge Calloway's fingers tapped lightly against the bench. He looked at Marcus for a long time. Then, in a low, strained voice, he finally said the words no one expected. Request granted. Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. His grandmother's home was safe. The bank had been exposed. The judge who had mocked him was now being held accountable. He had won. And yet, as he looked at the journalists waiting to speak with him, he realized something. This wasn't just about winning one case. This was about making sure no one else had to go through this again. A reporter rushed up to him. "Mr. Bennett, do you have any final comments about today's ruling?" Marcus thought for a long moment before finally answering. "Yeah." He looked straight at the cameras. "We're just getting started.